Good evening, Narsley family, and welcome to all our guests from near and far. It's such an honor to be hosting this evening at Hampstead Garden Suburb Synagogue, a conversation with Dayan Gelley, the Rosh Bezdin of the London Beth Din. Dayan Gelley is no stranger to our congregation. For many years, Dayan Gelley davened as a member of our congregation, prior to having his own congregation in Golders Green. But Dayan Gelley is a great friend of HGSS, and I want to say at this moment that he is also a great friend, I consider personally. Dayan Gelley, you've been a rock to me since arriving in this country, always there with words of chizuk, and always there to guide me and advise me halachically, hashkafically, and just in terms of the contours of the community. I want to tell everyone, Dayan Gelley is the Rosh Bezdin of the London Beth Din, but his reach and his influence really extends far beyond London. It's really throughout Anglo Jewry and beyond. Having grown up in Australia, I know that Australian Jewry, and no doubt throughout the Commonwealth, turn to the London Beth Din for advice, for guidance, for halachic practice. And that's true of the Commonwealth. That's true throughout Europe, as I saw recently at the Conference of European Rabbis. And Dayan Gelley is a gift to all of us. Dayan Gelley has been working around the clock over the last 18 months, 2 years, together with the chief rabbi and the other Dayanim, to establish principles that will enable us to align ourselves with the British government, with the NHS, and the new opt-out laws for organ donation. It is such an honor that Dayan Gelley has agreed to have a conversation with us, to explain to us the framework for our ability to be part of this new understanding. And without further ado, I give you Dayan Gelley, who will give us all a shir on the fundamentals. After which I will join Dayan Gelley for a conversation, for some questions, and we welcome, of course, as always, questions from the community via our Facebook Live page. Dayan Gelley.
Good evening, Rabbi Friedman. Thank you for those kind words. I wasn't expecting that at all. Dear friends of HGSS, Norrisley Synagogue, for those of you who still remember me after all these years, when I was first asked by the rabbi if I would join tonight, one of my enticements was I thought I was going to meet all my friends, but alas, and even the forum, I thought there was going to be a big screen with loads of little pictures, and I'm going to see Mark and this one and that one, and etc. And the way it's working, I'm sort of looking at myself, talking to myself. But in any event, I'm happy to be with you and to share with you some of the issues that have arisen, because most recently, the date that the government originally set for the opt-out to come into fruition, into practice, has already passed, and some people are anxious already. Oh, I've missed the date, and what does it mean? And have I got to quickly opt out? And will I lose if I don't? And what should I do? What's right? What's wrong? So I thought perhaps best is really to try and explain the question first. There's a very local question, this question that the government have instituted an opt-out, meaning that if a person does not opt out of this program, then automatically the government, and that they've already brought into law, have a right to retrieve, they don't like using the word harvest organs, it doesn't sound good, so retrieve a person's organs, and after death, if they're suitable, and give them to somebody who desperately needs them. And the concept of opt-out, I'm sure you all know this, but just to speak it out aloud, is that if a person is averse to that and particularly does not want to be an organ donor, then they have to say so. If not, they are presumed to have consented, and their organs, according to law, could be taken. I'm not debating now the moral issue or the halachic issue of presumed consent. It's not relevant now, it's past. It's not up to us if the government did ask for input from different communities. I'm sure the Jewish community said what they said at the time, but this is where we are. So people are asking the question, do I have to opt out? Now, let's analyze what is the question by beginning with what does the person want? Ultimately, are they interested in joining the National Health Service registry? Are they interested in being a donor, a cadaver donor, which is a donor after death, to the National Health, and it'll go in by rotation to the next person, or are they not? Let's assume the answer is, and again, it's not for me to say what people should do, shouldn't do, even though I do want to say what's considered a mitzvah or an obligation or appropriate or correct, but let's leave out my view of what a person ought to do. I'm going back to the person who's asking the question, should I opt out? Do I have to opt out? What do they want? If ultimately their view is, whether on halachic reasons or spiritual reasons, emotional reasons, they do not want to be donors, everybody to their own, then what are they asking? So if you don't want, so go on the registry and opt out. If you're asking the question, if we don't opt out, are we guaranteed that if it arises, and by the way, it's very rare in this country, it should arise, because so I'm uneasy about talking about the scenarios, but we're talking about, God forbid, a young, healthy person has an accident on his bike in the Pennines and etc. To be cliched, they're not talking about a regular, even a senior person or a person who has been unwell. They're not going to take that. So the likelihood that this is going to happen in terms of donors per year, I think has been estimated statistically. Looking at national averages, we're talking about a possibility of 1, possibility of 2. But in any event, let's say that God forbid, a person should be in that situation. What they could rely upon, ostensibly, is a government promise to the Jewish community, a minister's promise to the Jewish community that, listen, if at the time the family explained to the group that's dealing with this, whether the particular nurse and the grouping, and tell them that, listen, that the deceased would never have wanted this, and we don't want this, and etc., and we just didn't register, and blah, 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 the hospital are not going to take an organ away from a person in a situation where that is the family sentiment. This is what we've been told. It's not enshrined in law. From what we know of the NHS, it's very probable, because that's the way they work. They're not going to force an issue, but legally, the family have no right. Now, if the family make the case that the deceased would not have wanted to give, and they try and prove it one way or another, that may be something. But if it's the view of the family are not parties to this as such, and therefore legally the hospital, using government guidelines within the law, could realistically go and retrieve those organs from that deceased person. How likely is it? Highly unlikely. Therefore, going back to the question, this is the person who we began with saying does not want to donate their organs. But his question is, has he got to click on the registry and express and tick off what his position is? Or can he rely that later on, if it ever is relevant, he'll be able to make his position, or the family will be able to make his position clear at that time? Probably that's okay. My personal advice on a case by case if a person would come to me from any community, not on a communal level, because we're never going to tell communities to opt out. We don't tell them what to do. It's the person who asks you. I would tell them, if you're going to opt out any case, so opt out now. If you don't want to give and you've made up your mind, so just go on and just say you don't want to be a donor. There's nothing wrong with that. Loads of people don't want to be donors for all types of reasons, and there's nothing wrong with that if that's your view, and go and do it. Why rely for later on? However, if they're asking an assessment, if we were to rely, we're queasy about clicking on donor stuff, we don't want to get involved with that, should it all be okay? Probably in all likelihood, it should be okay. That's the easy bit. What I really think is, the question is, when people are asking, do I have to opt out? What they're really saying is, we would like to be organ donors. We would like to give. And therefore, we would just like to go on the registry and say, no, we're organ donors. And the question is, in halakha, in Jewish law, is that permissible or is that not permissible? And if it's permissible, is it a mitzvah? If it's a mitzvah, is it even an obligation? So that question really, if you think about it, has got nothing to do with a new opt-out law. The same question could have been raised and should have been raised for years in the past, whenever someone's thinking of being a benefactor and it's and giving, and this is what Jewish people are all about, and they want to be organ donors. Is it correct according to halakha? And in addition to which, is it correct or feasible through the NHS system in particular? So I'm mainly going to address that particular point. If I'm going over points that you all know already and you're a little bit bored, Rabbi Friedman, please intervene and tell me bored, and please go on to something more advanced. But let me begin with that. So, very interesting. What's the situation of being a live donor? A Jewish person being a live donor, as you all know, if you're a live donor, then you can give it to your nearest, dearest, you can stipulate who you want. If it goes into the NHS system, then one cannot, so then it goes into the system and the first person who's compatible will receive it. Going on to, for a live person to donate, it's actually very interesting halachically, because there are a number of issues one would have to contend with. First of all, if a person himself is going to endanger himself somewhat, it's something much discussed during Corona. Am I allowed to go out and to endanger oneself today with Corona if the government say there's a problem, and possibly endanger others? So there's a whole series of laws in halakha regarding endangering one's own life, regarding endangering somebody else. Obviously, they've each got different criteria. Someone who's going to donate a liver, he goes through a serious operation. Someone who's going to donate a kidney, it's less serious, but nonetheless. Bloods and platelets, there's very little involved, even bone marrow. There's the actual operation, actual removal is not dangerous. If it needs to be done under anesthetic, that could be an issue. So those are issues. But the consensus of halachic decisors is, of poskim is, yes, certainly one should give whenever one can. It's a big mitzvah. The poskim, the decisors, go short of saying it's an obligation. Now, why should it be an obligation? Yes, it could be, because what happens if there is somebody who desperately needs an organ in order to survive, and they can't get it elsewhere, they don't have a match, or no one else is willing to give it to them? On the list, they're way behind, or they're not receiving it, and you or any one of us is able to donate that organ and save their lives. That is called the mitzvah of pikuach nefesh. And why should it not be an obligation, not only a mitzvah in terms of it being a kind deed and something beautiful to do, but why isn't it a chiyuv? What happens on Shabbos if I see somebody struggling and it's a situation of life and death? I can't say, well, it's Shabbos and I prefer to keep my Shabbos. I've got an absolute obligation called a chiyuv to go and save the other person's life. So similarly, why has a live person not got an obligation to give his organ to save somebody else? So this goes back already to 16th century responsa, where it was ruled that because it means giving of myself, literally my flesh and blood, and putting myself in some risk, even though it might not be a major risk statistically, so you can't tell a person they're obligated to do it, but nonetheless, it is a mitzvah, and that person will receive brachot, and all the brachot that come with saving somebody else's life, which has got to be tremendous. What happens now when it comes to a cadaver donation, whereby a person wants to donate when they're not alive anymore? So you could argue, well, even better, they're not endangering their lives, so and they don't need it anymore. So of course, give it in a situation, let's say, where it is pikuach nefesh, and again the halachis make a difference. This is all based on pieces of Talmud. It's too intricate to go into tonight, whether there is a person who is now ill and you're saving someone's life, or, for example, if you're just giving it to the ether, where it may be used for somebody, etc. These could all be differences. But let's look at the broader concept. For a person, when during their lifetime, to sign a register whereby they say they're giving the organs for after they're no longer alive. Is that plain sailing, or is there a problem? So in truth, there is a problem, and there's possibly three problems. One problem is there's a biblical inhibition of what's called nivul hames, whereby one doesn't desecrate a deceased person. You may well be aware, many years back, there was a whole issue in Israel with autopsies. It's a big issue in England as well, and the people over here have worked very hard to minimize post-mortems, because a post-mortem, by definition, even though one could learn a lot of medicine and it's helpful and etc., but at the end of the day, it does involve cutting up a person. I'm sure it's done as compassionately and as dignified as possible, but it does involve cutting up a person, removing limbs, organs, whatever it may entail, and that carries a biblical prescription. One's not allowed to do that according to halakha. So here the question is, yes, but can I do it for purposes of pikuach nefesh? That's one question. Second question is that there's an obligation on a Jewish person who dies to be buried. What's got to be buried? The whole of the body's got to be buried. By definition, if one removes an organ, gives it to somebody else, that organ isn't going to be buried. So what happened to the mitzvah aseh, which is a positive commandment to bury a person? So why am I allowed to just dispense with this biblical instruction to give, to apply kvura, burial, to all limbs? I mean, we all know that, God forbid, someone loses a limb, even the lifetime that's put away is buried with a person. But this is worse, because here the deceased died with all these limbs, and one's removing part of it, and which will not be buried. Then there's another issue, that a person who dies is asur b'hana'ah. One's not allowed to derive benefit from that person for whatever. You couldn't take the hair and use it to make a wig. You can't take bits and pieces and use it for other things. And again, we learn that from verses in the Chumash, and this is a biblical injunction. You can't benefit from a mace, a deceased person. So the whole notion of giving, whether the NHS registry or not, is problematic. However, the rabbis already, we're going back already 40, 50 years more, wrote responsa about this and allowed it all. Not everybody. Some maintained it's problematic. Some maintained from a philosophical standpoint is problematic. You know, a person's going to give away their retinas or their eyes or their corneas, and what's going to happen after 100, after Tchiyat HaMesim, when they get up, are they going to be missing them, and etc. And that's not the outlook of the Torah. Don't give it. But they were a minority, and the majority ruled that even a cadaver donation is permissible. What happened to all the prohibitions that I mentioned earlier? So they cover them. And what they say is, for the sake of pikuach nefesh, that where there is an ill person there ready waiting to take it, so these particular prohibitions can be overridden. In terms of the fact that there's an obligation to bury, they say to bury something that otherwise would, God forbid, would rot otherwise, but if it's going to be implanted in somebody else and get a new life, so to speak, so it doesn't need burial. And each one of the prohibitions that I mentioned have got their own issue or their own reasons to give certain allowances, and therefore, at the end of the day, the poskim do allow a person to give instruction that when he's not alive to give away his organs. They don't discuss presumed consent. I'm sure in Jewish law it's against Jewish law and thought. Nobody else has got a right to come and take parts. The family don't have a right. If the deceased didn't express a wish in his lifetime, then there's no way that it can be presumed to be given. But there we are. That's the ideal situation in Jewish law. We're here in England and we follow English law on that. But the concept is not problematic, according to most. However, and this is where we have to be careful how the organs are retrieved and under what criteria. Number one, let me ask you, can one donate a heart? So at the current time, a heart cannot be given. Why can a heart not be given? Because it's actually, medicine is rapidly changing, and they've already got a new way, a new patent way of keeping a heart alive even after a person's dead, in order they can transplant it into somebody else. But the conventional wisdom until now, and that's in the mainstay, is that once a person has died a cardiac death, then that heart cannot be used anymore. To go and remove it from the person while the person is still alive would be, so to speak, murdering or taking the life of that person, because if they're still alive, regardless of the fact that in quality of life, the quality may not be great. And, if we looked philosophically, without religion, they maybe say, listen, you've got no quality. This can go to somebody who can have still a full life ahead of them, and etc. Surely that's correct. But as Jews, we follow the law, and that will be absolute retzicha. This was already, which is murder. This was ruled on by Rabbi Moses Feinstein. He actually ruled that a heart transplant is a double murder, because you're going to have to remove it from the recipient as well, and that's also taken while he's alive. And this one he assumed that it's only going to work for a very short time, and he called it at that time, it's a double whammy and double murder, and it can't be done. So what am I alluding to with that? Okay, so a heart we can't give. However, what about a kidney? What about liver? What about a cornea? What about other organs that one would otherwise want to give, and could even be a mitzvah to give? If one can give, I've already said that, then it's a mitzvah to do it. So the question of time of death is now paramount. So you'll all be familiar, and this is not my topic of tonight, so I don't want to, and I've gone way beyond my time in any event. But Rabbi Friedman, I just want to thank you for all you've done in the community since you're here, and for your company. And I know you're a gentleman, and I know you're not going to be quick to stop me. So, but please do. But just very briefly, there is the big question as criteria of death. Is it, to put it succinctly, is it brain death, brainstem death? Is it cardiac death? Is it respiratory death? Now, if in Jewish law a person is not deemed as having died, he's still alive, then obviously one cannot remove an organ from him, because removing that organ is going to kill him, or it's going to bring his death nearer. The Jewish law is, halakha is, a person who is a ghost, who is dying, you can't touch them for fear that you may bring their death forward even by 1 iota. Here, you're outright going to bring the death forward if one removes an organ. So the question is, are they alive? Are they not? And here is where, well, we haven't quite sorted it out within the system. The British system uses brainstem death. The question is, even if Israel or brain death will be permissible, brainstem death, which means not the whole of the brain, that is worse. And there are certain conditions in Jewish law that even if we were to consider it as death, it would have to comply with those conditions, which currently in the NHS, much as the greatest people in the world, they're doing everything well within their remit and guidelines. But as the Jewish people, we've got laws outside of English law, which we have to conform with. Even if they were to use cardiac death or respiratory death, then depending how that's done, if at the end of the day someone who is still breathing but needs support of a life support machine is going to be removed from that life support machine in order that their breathing should peter out, even though they are what's called spontaneous breathing, they're breathing themselves, and then die in order to retrieve that organ, then that's also strictly forbidden. So where we are, and I'm about to finish, is the following. The concept to give is great, and it's a mitzvah. The problem is that the current setup with the NHS registry, they are retrieving organs in a way which is not yet compatible with Jewish law. What's the great idea? We had this idea years ago, and the chief rabbis tried to revive it. We wrote it down in our paper at the time, and Professor Warrens was extremely helpful within the NHS to try and get the target, but we didn't make it at that time. And that is that the NHS should say, we will have a different faith criteria, whereby we will say that if this is a Jewish person, he or she wants to donate organs, then we will do so within the criteria of the Jewish faith. We don't know what it is, but we will be in contact with their rabbi or their hotline before we retrieve an organ. And if that's done, then one could sign up and be assured that, God forbid, that this should come to happen, then it would only be retrieved in a way which is compatible with Jewish law. So we've got everything. We've got the mitzvah of donating an organ. At the same time, it's done within halakha, where it not be considered a serious issue of shortening a person's life in order to retrieve that organ. That hasn't yet happened, and it's work in progress. As COVID-19 sort of stopped the world, it stopped that as well. The government have said that even though it has come into law, the opt-out, there's going to be no change that they envisage within the next 18 months. Within the next 18 months, the practice is going to continue as it's been till now, so no one needs to run. There are no deadlines, friends, because it's a moving date. It's not once. If you don't catch it by this time, if you don't sign on, you've missed it. At any time, you can sign on. At any time, you want to go on and sign off, sign off. It's a very flexible system. But if a person wants to be absolutely sure that the organs will not be taken, because that's what their choice is, then they're quite entitled to opt out. If one does want to give, then one can only give once there is a faith clause that I would like to donate within the confines or within the guidelines of the Jewish faith, and the NHS will be delighted. We've met with the top people there, and they've said, listen, for us, if we don't get everything, so we get something. We're happy with that. Every single one counts, and we'd be forever grateful for that. So we're doing a Kiddush Hashem by explaining that we are giving. We encourage all good donation in principle, the mitzvah of saving lives and helping other people, which is a tremendous trait of the Jewish people. But as we stand today on the 1st of June, the system hasn't yet been finessed, and we are eagerly and earnestly waiting for that to happen. Let's stop over here for now, and if there are questions, we'll take it all further.
Well, thank you so much, Dayan Gelley. I'm going to echo some thoughts in the comments. Dr. Alan Fox says, really good and clarified a difficult topic. Thank you. And it really, it's so inspiring to see. I think we all sit here and recognize that to be a Dayan on the Beis Din is so much more than simply knowing the kosher laws. One has to be an expert in the medical field, in halachic issues. Certainly I know that the amount of time the Beis Din spends on choshen mishpat, issues of civil cases. So we are really in awe of you, Dayan Gelley, and feel very blessed to have you as our Rosh Beis Din. Can I ask the Dayan a hashkafic, a philosophical question? So many of these donations that one is making, certainly apart from the kidney and the liver, the assumption is that the person is dead. So from a hashkafic perspective, can you do a mitzvah after you die? I mean, you've donated now. When does it count for? Is that a fair question, or it's not a halachic question?
It's an amazing question, and it's discussed. It's discussed in all responsa that we know that when a person isn't alive, he's chafshi min ha-mitzvot, he's released of mitzvot. That's the reason actually why men in a cemetery tuck in their tzitzit, because they don't want to be seen as mocking the dead. I can do mitzvahs and you can't do mitzvahs, because as Jews, we consider it a great merit to be able to perform a mitzvah, and so to speak, the deceased can't do it anymore. But there's no question about it that if a person has invested or committed or promised to do a mitzvah, then that mitzvah has got to count from the moment that he's committed to it during his lifetime. And I'll prove it to you from a piece of Talmud, because the Talmud says that once a person has committed in his mind to do a mitzvah, then it's already nechshav, it's considered he's done that mitzvah, and he gets already reward for doing the mitzvah. It's amazing, because if he thinks or commits to do a sin, then it doesn't count until he's actually done it. The person doesn't really want to do it. But with mitzvahs, it goes the other way around. So it's certainly on the account of the person who gives it during their lifetime.
Oh, excellent. Thank you. So under the new guidelines, the family will be consulted. If the person does not opt out, so family will be consulted. Is there always sufficient time to consult? Will the NHS make an effort to find family members? And the Dayan also mentioned that with the new faith laws, the NHS doctors and nurses would turn to the rabbis. Is there time to talk to the rabbis? How do you establish who the person's rabbi is?
Okay, so we're going to assume in most cases there's opportunity for a family. I mean, the rare case of someone cycling in the top of the country and etc., and it's impossible to get there, adverse weather condition, etc. There's still phones and the blessed Zoom and everything else, and etc. So I don't think that's a problem. But in terms of the rabbi, they're well set up and structured at NHS. They plan to have what they call a SNOD. Sorry, I don't know what the Rashi Tevot exactly stand for, but the S is for special nurse, OD, you work it out. And this special nurse is going to have available the telephone numbers of the appropriate people of the different faiths. That's going to be part of the paraphernalia in front of them, and it's all going to be available. They're not going to start looking on the internet for a rabbi of a particular community in a particular place. the idea is there'll be a hotline, because could be the rabbi will say, listen, I'm happier if you pass this on to a senior rabbi, and etc. And that's all that's a waste of time, or could waste precious time. Time is paramount in these issues, and therefore there'll be a hotline and a number to call, and that's how it's envisaged. They concede that it's possible they can't get hold of family, and then they'll just invoke the law. The question is, in terms of assessment, how likely is that? We think highly unlikely. Highly unlikely.
Right. But certainly those members of the community who don't necessarily have family members who are proxy, who are nearby, should be thinking about these things well ahead of time.
Yes, I think so.
Right.
I certainly do think so. By the way, can I just come back on the point when you asked, is a mitzvah? Do you know it cuts both ways? Because a mitzvah in terms of a good deed, I've answered that. Yes, it is, even though the ultimate mitzvah is only going to be performed after his death. But if you would be talking about, has he got an obligation to save somebody's life, how can he have an obligation when he's not alive anymore? And has he got an obligation when he's alive to do something after he's dead? And that probably he doesn't. So to say chiyuv, which is a strong word, a person's obligated in Jewish law to be a cadaver donor, that's too strong. You can't say that, but there's no question about it. It's a mitzvah. Sorry.
Right. No. So that's very helpful, because essentially, while that says that it's a positive, wonderful thing, it certainly does make things clear in terms of one's Jewish obligation. So anything that one does above and beyond is a bonus, but at that stage there can't be any obligation. So I think that's certainly helpful. I mean, certainly it's we have to be very sensitive around such topics, but from a strict letter of the law perspective, it does clarify. So thank you, Dayan. The Dayan mentioned that there would be this, and now it's come up in the comments here. Thank you, Jeremy Crane, specialist nurse for organ donation, who will call the rabbis who have been appointed. Can I ask the Dayan, are the Bate Din in this country all on the same page concerning these matters?
I would have thought very much the same. Yes, I would have thought, which means that in a situation where we're clear with halakha, because that's where the controversial bit would lie. There are those who are happy to allow brain death to be considered death, but my humble view is that it's a little bit ignorant, because for those who don't know, for the doctors obviously they know, but for those who don't know, they read about Israel and they compare that with here, and one can't put all brain death and brain stem death and hypothalamic death and etc. all in one. It's not one and the same thing. Someone's got to be very careful. But there you're going to have difference of opinion, and different Batei may be of different view. But once we've cleared that, whereby there is a formula that they will only retrieve once the person has died according to all shittot, all views, if you want, then I'm pretty much of the view that everyone would say, yes, that organ can be retrieved. But I can't really speak for everybody. You never know.
Right. We have Madeline Cohen, who is asking about organ banks, and I assume she means things like cornea donations. Are we allowed to donate and have it sit there until needed?
That is something slightly more problematic, because, as mentioned, the basis of the ruling is it's based on one of the very great poskim from over 200 years ago, Rabbi Yehezkel Landau, whereby he ruled and proved from the Talmud that it's only when you have a person there who needs it. Now, on a registry, there are always people who need it. There are people queuing up. So if not this one, the next one, etc. Whereby if they're stored, that is different, and that is more problematic. Nonetheless, there's some who say a cornea is really skin, not flesh as such. and therefore it could have a slightly different ruling. But for the moment, we're going to say one can give everything, and that actually could be given.
Okay. Just a question here. Just checking with the Dayan.
Yeah, that's okay.
All right. Victoria Goldsmith has asked, I've just lost my screen here. Victoria Goldsmith has asked, can we receive a heart from a donor?
Right. Okay. That is, again, a very fair question. Now, let's assume that this heart was retrieved in a way that's forbidden according to Jewish law, because the country, the United Kingdom, is not bound by Jewish law, and they can work within their parameters. So they've done nothing wrong as far as they're concerned. The fact that in Jewish law it's forbidden, even were they to have retrieved it from a Jewish person, and even if they were retrieved from a Jewish person upon the behest of that Jewish person, but once it's there and it's available, then to go and say they cannot have it, that's not correct. They will be able to take it. Even if in Jewish law something would have been wrong, and even if you consider it an avera, sinful in doing it, which it isn't, by the way, because it isn't for the non-Jewish community. They're not bound by these laws. But even if it would have been in Israel, and it was a secular hospital that's retrieved a heart, and if they'd asked the rabbis who said you're not allowed to do it, but they did it, one would still be allowed to take it. This is a posed question. It's a very good question, Victoria, but the answer is yes, at the end of the day, that can be done. I remember this was a big issue when there was a question, if we don't give organs at all times, so how can it be received and we don't give? And I never bought into that argument, because we do give, and we encourage giving of a live donor, we encourage giving of a cadaver donor, and etc. What we're saying is it's got to be within the parameters of Jewish law, and when it is gesundheit, as they say, perhaps the wrong word, but which means, in a healthy way. But yes, you have it. So to say that we will take in a situation where it wasn't done in the same way, I think is just being a bit silly. It's cliched, and I don't see anything wrong with that.
Right. There's a question here from Jeffrey Berman who asks, are people with a known disease, for example, cancer, obliged to opt out? Now, I assume what he means is that if it's terminal, and so as to avoid any pressure on the family or discussion in the family, should one already make one's own determinations?
I mean, no one's ever going to take an organ from a cancer patient, so it's irrelevant. It's not going to happen. But if for one's own peace of mind, one wants to opt out, again, I say, feel comfortable and opt out. The government understand there are going to be people who want to opt out, and you're perfectly entitled to do so.
Right.
We are encouraging those who are able to, don't opt out. We want to give back to society and etc. We are encouraging people to remain within, but it's got to be within the parameters of halakha.
Right. Are there? Okay, let me see other questions. Paula Greenberg Wheel is asking a question here about the means the hospital uses to retrieve an organ. Are there any issues around the means that they may do so, or once we've established, I assume that that the person has passed, then the means, maybe this comes back to the Nivel Hames question that the Dayan posed earlier.
Okay, we've been assured by top hospital personnel that they're very conscious of the fact that people consider this a desecration, and they do the minimal amount and it's sewed up afterwards. So I don't think that's an issue, but there is an issue in means, and could be I don't know if this was referred to, but it's worth saying this. Another problem is that if the hospital want to gear a donor up whilst they're still alive, even though the actual retrieval is only going to be done after they're dead, but they want to give them certain drugs and certain whatever it may be in order to coagulate, whatever the purpose is, whilst they're still alive, that is forbidden in Jewish law because that is called a goisis. So including in means, that is something that we would also have to talk to the SNOD, the specialist nurse at that time, that shouldn't be done.
Well, thank you so much, Dayan Gelley. This has been truly an informative and opened up all of our minds to this important discussion, important conversation, and a conversation that no doubt we will all continue to have with our loved ones. The conversations that need to happen sooner than later. And just to summarize some of the ideas that you've shared with us this evening, firstly, Dayan Gelley pointed out that this is not a new question. The fact that the opt-out law is really only a conversation starter for us, but it's been a decision that we always had to make one way or the other. Dayan Gelley emphasized the fact that it is a big mitzvah to donate a kidney, and I think that really is clear even in our later discussion around during one's lifetime or after one's lifetime. Clearly, to donate organs during one's lifetime is a big mitzvah, albeit not a chiyuv, not an obligation, but certainly a big mitzvah. And that's no doubt why one finds, particularly in places like America, Israel, that amongst the religious community, the numbers of live donors are so much higher per capita than in the general community. So that I strongly add my sentiment to Dayan Gelley. Dayan Gelley needs my sentiment, but those of us who can donate kidneys and other live organs are strongly encouraged to do so. It is a very big mitzvah. And certainly, like Dayan Gelley said, it is permissible, according to most of the poskim, to give after one's lifetime, and the question becomes when we establish after one's lifetime. So once again, thank you, Dayan Gelley. If we get further questions going forward, and yes, Dayan Gelley?
I could have a comment. I don't know whether the audience are aware, but there are two organizations, one's called Renewal, and one's called Matnat Chaim, who arrange, in America, it's already in the thousands, in America, in Israel, and even in this country, for those who have that generosity of spirit and want to give in their lifetime, literally to save somebody else's life. There is one is able to do through these organizations, and they can all be looked up online and or be there. They work bona fide. They work together with local hospitals, and they're doing great mitzvahs. So just to make people aware of that.
Thank you. Yasher Koach again, Dayan Gelley, and Yarech Yamim al Mamlachto. May you continue to serve our community and global jury for years and decades to come. Thank you for everything you do for us, Dayan Gelley, and thank you for this evening.
Thank you. And can I just say, I look forward to be able to see everybody, not only in the face, but in the flesh. Please God, should us a good time, good when we get back to the synagogue, back to shul, and life resumes in the new normal. Zolzain, doesn't matter. I look forward to see everybody there. All the best. Good night, and stay healthy and safety, everybody. All the best.